It's a brand new year, and you may be setting out on a brand new campaign. But how are you going to get started on this new adventure?
You may be checking out some of our class guides, thinking about what kind of character you want to play, rolling up your stats, figuring things out. And you might want to try out some of these house rules that we've used in our campaigns for character creation to set your campaign off on the right foot. My name is Monty Martin.
And I'm Kelly McLaughlin.
And we are the Dungeon Dudes. Welcome to our channel where we discuss everything Dungeons & Dragons, including advice for players and guides for dungeon masters.
We upload new videos every Thursday, so please subscribe to our channel so that you never miss an episode.
Today, we are sharing the house rules that we've been using over several years for character creation in our campaigns. Character creation is one of the most fun parts, I think, of kicking off a new campaign. There's nothing like getting inspired and getting new ideas percolating around, but there's a few ways that we can smooth out this entire process.
The rules we're looking at today are there to help inspire your role-playing options, as well as being flexible and fair to give you more variety at the table.
Now, these house rules are in addition to the standard practices that you might explore during a session zero. We've got a whole video on that right up over here. So using these house rules in tandem with a really well-run session zero is the perfect recipe for kicking off a new campaign.
There's a lot to discuss today, so let's get rolling. One of the most commonly house-ruled options, and one that I'm pretty sure everybody has a different way of doing, is generating ability scores. There's a number of options listed in the player's handbook, and there are so many different people who have created house-ruled versions of how to generate these ability scores. Today we're going to talk about our method for generating ability scores.
Now, we've tried many different methods for ability score generation over the years. We have a fond love-hate relationship with rolling for ability scores. We've tried point buy, we've tried various fixed arrays, we've tried all sorts of different points methods for generating ability scores. But ultimately, what we settled on was a slightly more generous fixed ability score array. We've used this in several campaigns now, and it's worked really well for us.
If you're a fan of our Drakkenheim series, we also use these ability score arrays in that show. So a lot of people do ask us, how did you generate your ability scores? And it's using the standard array that Monty has created here, which is 17, 15, 13, 12, 10, and 8.
Again, this is a little bit more generous than the standard ability score array of 15, 14, 13, 12, 10, 8. And there's a few reasons why we settled on this. Our groups tend to include 3 or 4 players. Most recently, we have smaller groups. So the extra little bit of power that the players gain tends to compensate for this fact, and often that our characters very rarely play healers.
Yeah, we almost never have a healer, and so we need a little bit of extra help sometimes. The other reason why I love this standard array is because as a player, one of my favorite parts of Dungeons & Dragons is choosing feats. When it comes down to creating your character, once you've chosen your race, your class, and eventually your subclass, those are 3 of the biggest choices you get to make, but that locks you in to everything that you are going to gain through leveling up in the campaign. When you get to add in feats, for me, it's a fun little bit of variety to say, what cool, unique ability do I want to give this character that really fine-tunes them to the way I want to roleplay them? And by giving a player character just a little bit more power, you give that player the option to look more closely at the feats options rather than always having to take the ability score improvements.
In addition, because we're giving a 17 right off the bat, it means that player characters can start with an ability score as high as 18, but can't get that 20 right off the bat, so they still do have to use some ability score boost to get that far. It also means that players are able to choose a race and class combination that might be a little bit non-standard. Perhaps choosing a race that doesn't grant a bonus to the main ability score granted by your class, but still being able to start off with a high 17, getting that +3 modifier, that is really the point where you feel specialized in your class as well. So it gives a little bit more flexibility for those non-standard combinations and allows players to explore those feats much earlier on if they don't feel like they have to crank up their stats to get maxed out.
By not giving the player characters the ability to hit 20 right off the bat, though, you do kind of put that ability score improvement option out there for them at some point. But now it's a little bit more lenient on it, and they can have a lot more fun mixing and matching races and classes and feats and subclasses with a little bit more freedom to find what speaks to them.
Finally, there's a few things that make this a very fair array that I quite like. As opposed to rolling, which can yield some very random and, in my opinion, not very organic feeling characters anyways, the player characters always get one really big strength and always one or two weaknesses. They always have to accept that there's going to be a 10 and an 8 in one of their ability scores. This encourages teamwork because no one has amazing stats that are amazing in every single ability score. There's always some kind of trade-off or choice when they're building their character.
Monty and I are huge fans of rolling for your ability scores and have done it many, many times. The problem is that when you are running a long-term campaign, rolling stats can create some imbalance at the table. If one of your players ends up with very weak stats in several categories, where another player ends up with no weaknesses whatsoever, it can make the player who rolled a little more poorly feel left out of the fun at the table. Sometimes rolling stats works extremely well for one-shots or shorter campaigns because you really get to play around with the true feeling of what D&D is with rolling your stats. It's one of the most heavy traditions of Dungeons & Dragons. But with the fixed array for a longer-term campaign, you make sure to keep things balanced and fair for the entire party.
You might see this array and see that every character is using the same array, and they feel kind of samey. But every character still assigns their ability scores as desired, applies their racial modifiers, and then role-plays their character. And I find that this still yields characters that feel very unique and very different from each other. Players get to explore a lot of different options within this, and I think that the freedom to explore more options and know what your ability scores are going to be has meant that my players have been more and more creative about what options they want to explore.
And something that I've said in so many of these videos is I do think that there is an extreme importance about each player character having that 8. Playing into your flaws and weaknesses is some of the most fun at the table. This can create a lot of fun situations that just has hilarious outcomes, and it can be so much fun at the table for the group.
On the flip side, using this array, each player character generally has one really big strength, and only one, which means that they have to work together as a team and collaborate with one another. It means that no one player ends up having, well, I've got the highest strength and the highest charisma and the highest wisdom in the party because I rolled really well, and so I get to shine in so many different circumstances. It means that the player characters have to take their turns and work together because no one is going to be able to be the dominant force in the party.
In addition to the standard array, we've looked at another rule that can cause a lot of versatility with choosing your race and class options, and that is the floating ability score option.
This house rule modifies the way the bonuses granted to your ability scores by your race works. During character creation, you may take 1 point from any racial ability score bonus granted to your ability scores and move it to any other ability score which does not already gain a bonus from your race. What this means in play is that if you are playing a wood elf, you get a +2 bonus to your dexterity and a +1 bonus to your wisdom. Under this rule, you could either move that +1 wisdom bonus to any other ability score except for dexterity, or take one of the points that is granted to you from your dexterity and move it to any other ability score aside from your wisdom or your dexterity. This means that if you wanted to play a wood elf wizard and gain a +1 bonus to your intelligence score, you would be able to do that. This house rule opens up so many more race class combinations that are often ignored by players who might have that slight min-max power gamer sort of tendency where they always want to have an optimal boost to their ability scores for their class.
Not everybody out there is a min-maxer, but it can be a little bit strange at the table when you come in with a non-optimized character in a party of otherwise optimized players.
Indeed, this house rule is excellent if you have a few players in your group that are always going for the power combos, and a few players in your group that just want to explore their imaginations and try different combinations. It means that those players feel less penalized for being a little bit more creative and exploring an oddball option because they can mix and match things around to make their character still strong in the midst of a party where other players might be just going for the power combo.
This simple house rule takes the edge off the variant human for being the most powerful option to choose if you can't decide which other race best fits the character you're trying to play.
Indeed, the variant human's insane flexibility, gaining a feat, ability score bonuses wherever they need it, and an extra skill is really hard for a lot of the other player character options to match. And this simple tweak, which allows race class combinations to work and gel together that wouldn't otherwise have, really goes a long way to opening up your players' minds.
One part of Dungeons and Dragons that can be a little rough is when you are leveling up and you roll to see how many hit points you're going to gain, and you roll a 1 and end up with much lower hit points than the rest of the party. There's a simple house rule that we use that can help out with this, and it is the take half hit points rule.
This house rule is so popular that it's in the core rule books themselves. We use it, we love it, and we think it's very, very fair. It also goes hand in hand with the fact that we often create our characters starting at 3rd level or 5th level for a new campaign. And this rule, combined with the floating ability score bonus from the race and the fixed ability score array, means that everybody can make their characters before session 0. They can do all the work of getting their characters ready, playing around, imagining the different combinations they might explore, and there's no need to have us all together to witness each other's die rolls. And we can get that part done before session 0 or between session 0 and the first session of actual play. I have fond memories of entire character creation nights where it took us forever to roll the ability scores and roll the hit points and do all this stuff and put everything together. And it's such a huge change how much faster it is for everyone to make their characters and bring them to the table.
The rule's very simple. You take the average amount of hit points whenever you level up. There is a modification on this rule that still allows you to roll if you're interested in that. When rolling for hit points when you gain a level, if you roll below the average result for your hit die, you may take the average result instead. What this means is that your player characters can still roll to see if they get extra hit points, but they will never roll below the average amount offered.
This rule makes your player characters on average a little bit more robust and tough. Why we like it, again, is because we tend to use groups of 3 or 4 player characters, and nobody likes playing a healer in our tables. So we use this rule to compensate for that. It means that everyone's a little bit tougher and doesn't have to deal with the unfortunate circumstance of rolling a 1 when they gain hit points for their new level.
So that wraps up the mechanical side of our list of rules, but we're also very passionate about role-playing and getting the players at the table really into their character stories. And we have a couple house rules that can help out with getting all of your players on board and ready to role-play.
Most importantly, I love player characters that are strongly invested in both each other and the world they inhabit. But over the years, I found that giving my players a giant 30-page document outlining all of the details of my campaign setting really bogs things down. Players get overwhelmed by looking at this, and also it takes a lot of work to put such a document together, work that I would rather invest in other things like painting miniatures or preparing the actual adventures themselves. So I like to turn a lot of this over to the players, and it really helps me kickstart my campaigns and figure out that most difficult session 0 question: how do all the characters know each other, and why are they adventuring together?
The rule works quite simply. During character creation, you and at least one other player that's going to be joining that campaign must make a bond that previously existed, joining those two characters together in some sort of way.
A character can have multiple bonds with multiple other characters, and this is often necessary to bring the party together in some way, but no one can be left out of the loop. Every character must have some prior knowledge of the others. And really, if you look at a lot of movies, television shows, and fiction, many stories that we are told in our popular fiction already start this way anyways. The characters already have some knowledge of each other in some way. And I've used a bunch of handy tables passed down from RPG mapmaker Dyson Logos, inspired by the Fiasco role-playing game. We'll have the link to all those tables down in the description below, but the basics of it is that if the players can't decide I'm just going to roll for them and they have to deal with it and make that work. Some of these relationships are quite intimate. Characters might be siblings, parent and child, lovers, childhood friends, or otherwise. But there are other relationships which are much more recent.
You could go the road of having two players that survived a battle together, or one that saved another. You could do simple things like two characters who went to school together, or who have ran into each other several times in passing in their adventures and helped each other out. Or even two characters that just happen to live in the same town and are friendly acquaintances. The main idea here is that when you do watch a movie or read a book, oftentimes there's a lot of character development that happens, individual with those characters or those two characters. But during a game of Dungeons and Dragons, we don't always get the option to explore the deep backstories and plots that cause these characters to rely on one another. And when they're going out adventuring together, they are relying on one another and they need to trust one another. Monty and I are not big fans of parties that like to backstab each other or turn on each other or various things that can cause animosity at the table. So by creating these bonds and relationships, what you're doing is allowing them to add to their backstory things that we can't play out at the table. And that's how they know each other and why they care about each other and why they would agree to set out on a wild adventure together.
And also, it gives context to why they might disagree, but continue to work together. I have always disagreed with my siblings on many, many things, but I will always stick by them in a desperate situation. And so, taking that mentality allows the player characters to have a really fantastic dynamic between them. I'm of the opinion that the greatest manifestation of role-playing that occurs in Dungeons & Dragons is the role-playing that happens between the players, not the role-playing that the players act out on their own, and certainly not the role-playing that happens between one player and the Dungeon Master. When the players together are creating dialogue, are interacting with each other, are developing their characters on their own, that is one of the most magical experiences in Dungeons & Dragons. And these bonds and relationships are a way of putting kindling in the fire to spark that. Try it in your next campaign. If there is one rule I would advise every group implement, it is this rule.
The last rule we're going to look at today helps the characters link to the world that's being created. We've talked about how they can link to each other, but how are they going to be part of the wider world? This is a simple rule that we like to call the I know a guy rule, or the Lando rule.
I love the way this rule encourages the player characters to create NPCs that exist in the world and become a part of the adventures in the story. The rule works like this. When facing a difficult problem, a player character can declare, "Well, I know a guy," and invent a helpful NPC which the PCs can visit for aid in their current situation.
The PC must work with the DM to provide a quick summary of their history and relationship. Fewer details are usually better to leave room for creative play.
When the PCs try to interact with this NPC, the player that created them makes a charisma check to see how the NPC reacts, either positively or negatively.
A PC may use this ability a number of times equal to their intelligence or charisma modifier, minimum of once.
Player characters often think about other NPCs that might be involved in their backstory, their parents, their friends, their old mentors or masters. But oftentimes it takes a little bit of extra work to actually involve those characters in the campaign. This is often why so many player characters are orphans, because getting those NPCs involved can be a hassle. But for me as a dungeon master, I love looking at my players' backstories and deciding how I am going to use the NPCs proposed by those backstories in the coming campaign, and I make a point of doing so.
Monty and I have a long history of playing together in many campaigns, with Monty being the dungeon master and myself being the player. And even as a player, when I'm creating my backstory, I love creating a few NPCs that I hand over to Monty so that he can pepper them in wherever he wants in the campaign. I try to leave it open-ended enough that they could appear anywhere. but I already have a predetermined history and idea on what I want to happen with these characters, whether it's somebody I'm seeking out for vengeance or a family member I want to save or find or locate again. There's a lot of different options to play around with here, and creating NPCs of maybe your best friend, the blacksmith in the hometown, or a longtime lover of yours that you parted ways with years ago and haven't seen since, who might have had some magical powers. These are little things that you can hand off to your dungeon master and have them incorporate them into the campaign, which really makes your player character feel like part of a living, breathing world. And to me, that's where I get the most enjoyment out of playing Dungeons & Dragons, is when my character's backstory and history comes into play during the campaign.
As a dungeon master, you will create dozens of NPCs for your campaigns. A great habit to get into as a dungeon master that can help you use this rule in play is mark key NPCs with an asterisk, indicating that these NPCs could have their identities replaced with identities proposed by the player characters in their backstory. If a player character created a rogue that had interactions with a thieves guild, and they talk about their old partner in crime, start looking for your roguish NPCs in your campaign and use that partner in crime instead of the NPC that you were going to be creating. If one of your player characters grew up in a wizard's school and was trained classically in the arts of evocation, and you later need to have a council of wizards, that council of wizards could be made up of their own instructors. One of your player characters was part of a military. It should be the military of the prominent nation or empire that your player characters are going to be interacting with, so they can have interactions with their old war buddies and officers. Reduce the number of NPCs instead of increase the number of NPCs by combining the ones that you've created with the ones proposed by your player characters' backstories. This simple act will give you all the ammunition you need to really make your players feel like they are involved in the world.
Now, the I know a guy rule makes it sound like it can be used during the game at the table, which it could be. But Monty and I, in much of our experience, have found that actually having a discussion outside of the table where we talk about, would your character know anybody like this? Or, hey, Monty, my character has this part in their backstory. Could we work that in? Doing this outside the table allows both the DM and the player to have a moment to discuss how it's going to fit in and make a few tweaks to make it smooth out and really feel like part of the world. Then the next time you come to the game, you can drop the, yeah, I know a guy, and show up at Cloud City and there's Lando, and then you roll your charisma save and see if he's going to accept you or kick you out.
One of the really unexpected outcomes of these discussions has actually been how the I know a guy rule links back with the party bonds and ideals and, in fact, the relationships between the player characters. In our most recent character creation, Kelly had a character in his backstory that was a tough woodland mentor that took his character in and helped him survive in the early years. As we were discussing this NPC a little bit more, we realized that Jill's character herself was a perfect match for this NPC. So rather than creating an NPC, we decided, let's just link the two player characters using this method. So be on the lookout for how the player characters themselves could fill these roles. It really makes the group much more integrated and makes the story so much tighter.
So this has been a look at 5 simple house rules for character creation in Dungeons & Dragons 5th edition. If you have any awesome house rules for character creation, tell us about them in the comments below.
If you're enjoying our show, please consider supporting our work on Patreon. You can find out how you can contribute to the channel by following the links in the description below.
Don't forget to check out our live play Shadows of Drakkenheim, which airs Tuesday nights at 6 p.m. Eastern on twitch.tv/dungeon_dudes. You can find all the episodes from that season and Season 1 Dungeons of Drakkenheim up over here.
And of course, we have plenty more great house rules that you might want to consider using in your D&D campaigns right up over here.
Please subscribe to our channel so that you never miss an episode.
Thank you so much for watching, and we'll see you next time
in the dungeon.